Let's take a look at the Advanced Fighting Fantasy system. Hello, welcome to the Battling Barrow. My name's Kev.
And I'm Alfie.
In this video, we're going to have a look at the Advanced Fighting Fantasy game and look at its history up to its present. I've already done a complete retrospective on the Fighting Fantasy system, which you can watch here.
So what is Advanced Fighting Fantasy?
Advanced Fighting Fantasy is a role-playing game that was based on the original Fighting Fantasy series as well as the Sorcery counterpart. Its origins could be traced back to the Fighting Fantasy Introduction to Role-Playing Games by Steve Jackson that was published in 1984. This book covered how to make your own Fighting Fantasy adventures, act as a games master whilst your friends run through the adventures. This book also contained a few sample adventures, one of which was called The Wishing Well, which we'll come back to later. The book, like all Fighting Fantasy books, was full of evocative artwork and was done by Duncan Smith. In 1989, the first edition of Advanced Fighting Fantasy called Dungeoneer was released, taking the concepts of the introduction book and really expanding on them to make it its own system. The book was written by Mark Gascoigne and Pete Tamlin, and the illustrations were by John Sivek.
So how do you play it then?
Well, a video of this nature can't possibly cover a full-blown RPG, but let's go over the basics. Luckily, the rules for Advanced Fighting Fantasy are really streamlined, which is great for beginners, but perfect for long-time RPG players who, like me, don't have a lot of time on their hands to get into a really complex rule set. The game consists of a games master, which is called the director here, and players, which form the cast, as well as NPCs. It takes the concept of framing it like you were pretending to make a movie, which is something I didn't really like about this system and would drop that. It's very immersion breaking for me. Looking at the latest edition, which we will cover in a bit, it seems to have largely dropped it, apart from still referring to the GM as the director. The mechanics of the game use the same basic stats as Fighting Fantasy and Sorcery, but have special skills added. These are grouped into combat, movement, stealth and learning, and each group has a number of special skills under them. They range from 0 to 4 and are assigned by taking the character's initial score and using that to buy skills. So if you had a skill of 9, you could put 3 points into sword, 3 points into bow, 2 points into sneak and 1 point into dodge. Now, when having to make a skill test, you use the relevant special skill for the situation. So in the example above, if you had to dodge out the way of something, you could use the dodge skill, giving you a value of 10. Of course, you still use your base skills for other situations. There are 3 types of tests. Unopposed test, in which you roll 2 6-sided dice and a result must be less than the characteristic, usually skill, sometimes magic, and a special skill. This is an extension of the skill test of the Fighting Fantasy gamebooks. Opposed tests, where each character rolls 2d6 and adds the skill and the special skill and the highest wins. This is an extension of the combat procedure from the Fighting Fantasy gamebooks. Luck test. This is the same as the Fighting Fantasy gamebooks. Combat is handled in the same way as normal Fighting Fantasy, except this time damage is variable and based on a roll of 1d6, consulting a damage table for each weapon, as well as armour for the opponent.
Were there any supplements for the system?
Yes, a few actually. In the next year, in 1990, Black Sand was released, again written by Mark and Paul, but this time with illustrations from the great Russ Nicholson. And then in 1994, Alanzia came out. Black Sand added new rules to the game with special skills and spells, but the bulk of the book covered rules for games set in a city, particular Port Black Sand. Alanzia added more special skills and spells and covered rules for adventuring in the wilderness, as well as rules for mass combat. Although written for basic Fighting Fantasy books, Out of the Pit and Titan could be useful for the advanced system.
Where could I buy a copy?
The first edition is long out of print, and copies are well overpriced on the second-hand markets, but if you want to play the game, you can get hold of the second edition, which is still readily available. In 2011, Arian Games released the second edition of Advanced Fighting Fantasy, this time written by Graham Botley. This edition saw the magic system from the Sorcery series added to the game. Out of the Pit was then re-released by them too, with updated profiles for Advanced Fighting Fantasy. In fact, Arian Games has released many supplements for the system over the next 10 years, and these are all readily available on Drive-Thru RPG in PDF and in some cases print-on-demand formats. If you're interested in Advanced Fighting Fantasy, buy from here and support Graham and Arian Games rather than the inflated second-hand market. There is also a free introductory PDF available to see what the system is like. This contains the adventure Wishing Well that comes from the 1984 book updated to the new system, and some changes to the adventure as well. I've just found out that Arian Games are also publishing Warlock Returns, which is a throwback to the Fighting Fantasy Warlock magazine from the 80s I've covered on this channel, so I shall be getting hold of that at some point in the near future. Also in the future I may do follow-up videos where I create an Advanced Fighting Fantasy character and may run through the Wishing Well adventure too. So, have you played Advanced Fighting Fantasy? Are you interested in playing it? Let me know down below in the comments. But that's it for another video. Thank you for watching. Please do all that likey, sharey, subscribey stuff, and until the next video, stay safe and take care.